ago and nobody knows about them anyway. But history is important. Studying God's Word is important. And a lot of times what people don't realize is how much history is involved in studying God's Word. Because if you don't understand where you have been, you don't understand where our people have been, what we come through, you have no idea and no appreciation for where we are today. So studying antiquity, studying ancient things, studying things like early Judaism, and I call this early Judaism because that's essentially what it is. It's not what Judaism is today, but we have been studying Judaism at what it used to be. And I find it to be extremely productive. It helps me to see a lot of the passages in the scripture in a completely new and different way. The topic of Samaritans, which we have been kicking around now, I think 1 week we started on it. I tried to show to you the relevance of that topic by bringing quite a few passages from the New Testament and taking a new, slightly different spin on them to help you understand how, if you don't understand who Samaritans are, if you don't understand the issues that they have and where they come from, then understanding those passages actually becomes a little bit more challenging. There's not too many passages in the New Testament, particularly about Samaritans, but there are quite a few. And more than that, what's important, again, is the history. Samaritans are a community that's still around. There's about 1,000 of them left. Most of them are living right there in Samaria, essentially, near Shechem, the old sort of say, dwelling place of Israelites. And also, they live in, I think, Holon. They have a community in Holon. That's right. You
I
know
was
that.
going to tell you, yeah, very close to where I
So they have a synagogue in Holon. So have you seen a Samaritan? If you've seen their synagogue, you probably have seen their mezuzah. Have you seen a Samaritan mezuzah? You can't miss a Samaritan mezuzah. So like when you go through our mezuzah, we just have a nice little box, right, hanging. They have a huge plaque right by their door. I mean, their mezuzah, you cannot miss it. They take it very literally, and you take my words and write them on your doors. They literally, on the gate, the words of God are written. And it's written in ancient Samaritan language, which is actually, you can't miss because it looks completely different from Hebrew, kind of this Paleo-Hebrew looking language. I'll show you some of the images of ancient Samaritan next time. Well, 1 year in New York City, I went to an auction of very unique Jewish documents, and I got to see, first time in my life, face to face, sort of say, to see the Samaritan Torah, actually written in Samaritikon, which that's what they call that language. And so it's an ancient Samaritan language. It's an amazing thing. I've never seen a Samaritan Torah. I've only seen pictures. But in New York, I got up close and tried to make out a few words here and there. It looks a lot like Paleo-Hebrew, but it actually is slightly different. But if you've been studying Paleo-Hebrew, you can make out a few symbols that are similar. But it's fascinating. Samaritan culture is fascinating. I'm glad that we still have a community around to speak of this past. So we can at least solve maybe some riddles and mysteries about the past by having the community with us today. So let's dive into early Judaism, and let's dive into the Samaritans. As I said, we've already started this topic. Today, what I'm going to do is mostly history, mostly background. It's important to us to understand the origins of Samaritans. So, I will begin by saying that it is a common knowledge that Samaritans and Jews did not get along with one another. People know this. If I ask people, what do you know about Samaritans, one of the first things that they tell me, they don't get along with Jews. And so that's kind of like a common knowledge about Samaritans. Everybody knows that. Yet the origins and the identity of Samaritans are really, I would say, complicated. They're complicated because we don't have that much when it comes to ancient historical sources that we can rely on, that we can reconstruct the past. I don't know if you understand how history and a study of history works, but historians don't just sit and make things up. We look at ancient documents, we look at evidence, and we try to interpret the evidence the best way that we know how. Sometimes the evidence we have very little of. You could come across an ancient document, but that document does not speak for itself. It still has to be interpreted, it has to be understood. And then you have to compare it with another document that might actually contradict it. So it's no different than studying the history of this country. I'm sure you can find documents in this country that say this, and then that's a document from the north, and then you find a document from the south that says completely opposite. And you have to say, what did really happen? Because the northerners tell the story one way and the southerners tell the story another way. Guess what? It's really not that different in ancient Israel. There are always divisions between people. There are always factions. There are always groups. There are always different takes, sometimes on the same exact events of history. And each community remembers it differently. Well, unfortunately, with Samaritans, we don't have a lot to go on. And the stories that we have, a lot of the stories that we have that are about Samaritans, are not by Samaritans themselves. And that's why it's hard to say whether they're fair or not. Remember, as I taught about Sadducees, I told you that this is the same exact problem that we experienced with Sadducees. Almost everything we know about Sadducees is something said by a non-Sadducee, and usually by a person who really does not like them. So you wonder how well they are presented to us. You wonder if people said those things, any of them were true. Because when people dislike somebody, they tend to present them in the worst way possible. So I think that's how sometimes it is with Samaritans. Sometimes they get painted in the worst way possible. And I'll show you that actually right now. Here's the book of Sirach. If you're familiar with Sirach, it's actually called the book of Yeshua ben Sirach. Okay? And so the book, it's called Sirach in Greek and it's called Ben Sirach in Hebrew. It's a 3rd century BCE, late 3rd century BCE book. It's a beautiful book of Jewish wisdom. Sounds a little bit like Proverbs of Solomon and a little bit like the Torah. And this is what Sirach says. 2 nations my soul detests, and the third is not even a people. Those who live in Seir, and the Philistines, and the foolish people that live in Shechem. So, let's unpack this. 2 nations my soul detests, and then he's going to tell you which ones his soul detests. And the third is not even a people. So the first one is the ones that live in Seir. Who are these? Edomites. Thank you very much. The people who live in Seir are the descendants of Edom, Esau. Okay? That's what he says. My soul does not like these people. The people that live in Seir. They are annoying. And then the second one are the Philistines. Why? Well, we know why Philistines. They're also annoying. They've been fighting with Israel for their entire history. For as long as Philistines have lived in that land, and they're not native to Israel, they've been fighting Israelites. So, of course, he is annoyed by them.
Hamas today.
Well, no, they're not Philistines. Philistines came from the Greek, Aegean and Greek islands. They were not related to modern population in that area. Although they populated the same land, they're not related. So, the third nation that's not even a people, if you haven't figured out who this is, he tells you. It's the foolish people that live in Shechem. Who do you think are the foolish people who live in Shechem? In the 3rd century before Common Era, they're the Samaritans. So no wonder people say that Jews and Samaritans did not like each other, because here's Yeshua ben Sirach is a writing that is very representative of a Jewish culture, mainstream Jewish culture. Sometimes he comes on really strong. He says some pretty harsh things, and this is one of them. He clearly calls them foolish people that live in Shechem, and they're not even a people. That's what he says. So what do you think if somebody talked to you like that? I'm sorry, guys.
Would you repeat your question, please, Peter?
What do you think if someone talked about you like that? What would you consider? Would you be friendly with them? If somebody considers you not a people?
Walk on by.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, guys. I'm better, but not all the way. So I have another one for you. What do we know about the Samaritans? Their history, their origins. Well, we know that in 722 BCE, we know that Assyrian king Sargon II conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. And that northern kingdom is called Samaria. Samaria is a city. And we know that some northerners, they naturally fled south.
when the war comes, you run. But the Assyrians, they took other Israelites, they did not run away as slaves to their kingdom. They, of course, did not take everyone. Just the most useful people that could serve them. And Assyria basically deprived the defeated nation of their best, brightest people. And the rest of the population was left in their crippled state of affairs. So they were ruled and governed by Assyria. The northern kingdom of Israel is defeated at that point. And if you remember the history correctly, at that point, the kingdom of Israel is already splintered. The northern kingdom is already its own people. They have already started to move away and develop their own culture, their own worship. They set up their own altars, their own temples, their own priesthoods. So they're already running a system alternative and actually competitive with Jerusalem. And they get conquered, and they get taken away into captivity. So that's 722 BC, okay? So this is 6th century we're reading. Now what happens next is Assyrians had a strategy of holding on to the newly conquered lands. And this was an interesting strategy. They would repopulate them with the subjects loyal to them. And Samaria was repopulated with people from the Assyrian kingdom. They came from the city called Cutha, which is about 40 miles north of Babylon. So these are people who are living in Mesopotamia. Assyria runs that whole entire part of the world at that time. And what they're doing is they're taking slaves, taking Israelites as slaves from Samaria and moving them to Assyria, to Babylon essentially. And they're bringing these people from Cutha, Cuthians, from Babylon, and making them live in the houses of what's left of those people that they have taken away. And so what you have to realize, and this is a part of a cultural dynamic that people sometimes do not catch on to, is that Near Eastern people typically believed that each land has its own deities. So the god in Babylon is Babylonian god, and Babylonian people worship him because the whole entire region, the country, the territory, is kind of owned by this god. And it's like every neighborhood has its own god, if you want to think about it this way. And if you move into a new neighborhood, you don't bring your god with you. You start worshiping the local neighborhood god. That's what it is. So they believe that. They believe that the land and the deities are inextricably tied. So when the settlers came from north of Babylon and they moved now to northern Israel, they aspired to worship the local deity, who would have been the God of Israel, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? That's whom Israelites worshiped. So they tried that. They tried to embrace the local worship. But remember, by that time, the local people have already broken bonds with Jerusalem. They've already developed their own version of Judaism, if you want to think about it. Their own sacrifices, their own priesthood. Remember, they were sacrificing to golden calves and things like that. So they were already doing some really unkosher things, let's put it that way. And so this is when Kuthians move. And now they're encountering this new God, this new way of worshiping him, and they're trying to figure out how to make things work. Now that they're living in this new land has a new God. So they adopt Hashem as their God, essentially. But when the new settlers basically, who came from Babylon, experienced some hardships in northern Israel, what do you think? Which God they prayed to? They basically brought a captured priest back from the Assyrian captivity to teach them how to worship the local God properly. Because if you don't have good harvest, whose fault is it? God did not send rain. Well, which God? Well, this land belongs to this God, therefore I need to appease this God. I am not properly honoring this God who owns this land, who gives the rain upon this earth. Therefore, I need to figure out how to not transgress against this deity, how to worship this particular deity properly. So that's what they do. Let's bring an expert. They bring an expert from all the way from Babylon. It says in the second book of Kings, in chapter 17, the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and from Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So that much we know, that there's that your repopulation. Then verse 27 says, the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you carried away into exile, and let him go and live there, and let him teach them the custom of the God of the land. Does that make sense to you? They are moving to a new location. They're going to learn how to worship this new God that is attached to this land. So let's bring an expert. Let's bring a priest. And that's exactly what they do. And I'm sure he has taught them a few things, or perhaps pointed them in the right direction so they could appease the God of that land appropriately. So this is the history of Samaritan people. You have to understand, this is what's going to lay the foundation for their society. So one of the priests, says the second book of Kings, they had carried away into exile from Samaria, came and lived at Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. Do you know where Bethel is? Bethel is right next to Shechem. It's that area. Right in the it's Mount Ebal essentially. It's right next to Mount Gerizim. It says, verse 29, but every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the houses of the high places which the people of Samaria had made. Every nation in their cities in which they lived. So what happened? The people who were brought from all those places that we just listed, from Kutha, and there's a number, several other places, they continued to worship their deity still. They still made high places. And, of course, they were perhaps living in northern Israel. They weren't so strict about idolatry there. So they could get away with it. So we have a situation, a historical situation is developing that's not healthy at all. It seems that the Assyrians brought actually several people groups, not several nations. They're called nations in the book of Kings. They brought it from their kingdom, and they probably previously conquered those people as well. They were not native Assyrians, let's put it that way. And the settlers tried to learn the local ways from the priest, but in typical pagan fashion, the settlers just integrated their own existing beliefs with the newly learned Israelite ways of worship, likely creating a blend of their own religious tradition. Is there anything new under the sun? So imagine this. The Catholic Church moves to Latin America, and they set up church, and now people worship Mary and sacrifice chickens to whatever voodoo gods that they were previously worshiping before. We have Santeria, we have voodoo in Africa, we have all those kinds of native religions that have continued to exist, and now the worship of Christ and Mary has been incorporated in all of that. So like here's a worship to Mary and here's a worship to whatever voodoo deity, and let's offer this sacrifice to them. So syncretism. This is what we call syncretism. When you take one religious tradition, you mix it with another religious tradition, and you basically make a new religion. Probably something like that happened to the people of northern Israel. Now the question that I ask, that is a logical question, is what happened to all the Israelites that were there, that were left behind? And no doubt this had some sort of an effect on local northern Israelites. There were people who were not taken into Babylon, who were still living there. Some of them probably intermixed with the newcomers because they are the new influential society. And if you are at the bottom of a social level, right, if you're a disadvantaged person, this may be an opportunity for you to move up, is to marry with some of these new people who came in, who are advanced, who are politically connected. Maybe they have more money, but definitely they have power over you, for sure, because they've been brought here by the people who conquered you. So some people probably mixed with them, but some could have stayed aloof from the outsiders. You can imagine that some of them was going to say, I don't want these foreigners here. I don't like them. I don't want to be with them. So there's probably some segment of the local northern Israelites that blended with these newcomers, and some that probably didn't blend. That would be reasonable for me to consider, because a lot of times what the historians will tell you, they would say that they all intermixed. They just all became one happy family. Guess what? If I know anything about Jews, and that means I know anything about Israelites, it's not going to happen. They're always going to have groups, and they're going to splinter off and they're going to say, this is the synagogue I go to, this is the synagogue you go to, and this is the synagogue we all agree we would never set our foot into. So we have to have somebody we do not like sometimes. That's a part of Jewish history too. So no doubt there were some dissenters, and not everyone blended in with these newcomers. I can imagine that. That seems like a more likely historical scenario. So as the Syrians kind of continue to rule this land, guess what? Their rule came to an end. In 612 BCE, the Assyrian Empire fell, and Babylon took over its lands and its riches. And then the famous Nebuchadnezzar, or as he's called Nebuchadnezzar in Hebrew, he conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. So the north is already conquered, and then he reconquered that. He took over that land essentially from the Assyrians, and now he conquered the southern kingdom of Judah in the year 597 BC. So we have quite a few years that the northern Israelites are in this disarray, taken over by the foreigners. And now the southern Israelites are taken over. And he plunders and destroys the Jerusalem temple. That's what Nebuchadnezzar does, remember. He destroys the city, he takes all the treasures of the temple, and of course he takes all the brightest people from Jerusalem as well. Jerusalem is the place of elites. That's where the wealthy people are. That's where the educated people are. So we read stories like Daniel's story, for example. As a youth, he's taken away. Why is he taken away? Because he's going to serve the king now. And of course, he is an elite. So he's an educated man. He knows how to read. He speaks multiple languages. And that they groom him to be one of the, sort of say, people within the court. And him and a lot of other people like that are taken away, obviously. That's what happens. So the southern kingdom of Judah now falls as well. And now we're at the year 597. So the history of the Samaritans does not end there, of course. Now, Babylonians did not practice resettlement technique, not like the Assyrians. They did something else. They took the wealth of Judah, along with the 18-year-old king Jeconiah, if you remember that king. They took prophet Ezekiel and other elites to Babylon. And then southern Israelites were basically reunited with some of their northern brothers in captivity. Because guess what? The northern Israelites have been conquered. They've been living out there in Assyria, or in the same city of Babylon, and now these southern Israelites are taken to the same exact spot. So it's like a family reunion, only it took them quite a while to get reunited. But you can imagine that some of them probably made some connections. So over the years, there were other deportations of Judeans to Babylon. That there's different groups of people kind of followed streaming to Babylon. But many of the common Israelites, non-elites, they were left behind. They stayed behind. So Judah is not obliterated of all of its population. And neither was actually the north obliterated of all of its population. But this religious climate and the situation of the north and the south were different. Remember, they have different values at that point. They've already split up and they kind of gone in slightly different directions. But because Jerusalem was not repopulated and Judea was not repopulated by some other people from some other place, it essentially retained some of its own character in a much easier way than the north did. The north was, basically infiltrated by foreigners, essentially, by outsiders. So the historical climate just was so. The destiny of the north and the destiny of the south were actually a little bit different. And on these types of historical developments is where the Samaritan community or the northern Israelite community really develops. That's what we have to understand. Now, it's not yet over. In the year 540 BCE, the Persians conquer Babylon. Guess what? Wherever there's a big fish, there's always a bigger fish. So now comes the next empire. The Persians come. And in the year 539 BCE, what happens is Cyrus the Great allows the deported Israelites to return to their ancestral lands. He has a different policy of holding on to his power, to his vast lands. His idea is not repopulation. It's not just taking out the best elites and making this a depressed land. He's of a different mind. He will allow his subjects to retain their cultural ways, live in their lands, under the governors that he trusted, as long as they remain loyal and continue to pay their tributes. So he says, go back to your land. I've got plenty over here. Live there. Develop your society. Do what you need to do. Worship, be happy. Just keep paying taxes. And never stop. Because you're conquered. Now, if you don't like it, I will come and reconquer you again. And we can have this negotiation once again. But the policy is quite simple. It's very simple. I mean, this is what Romans did, by the way, kind of the same way. They allowed people to self-govern to a degree. There has to be a trusted governor. Sometimes that governor would be an outsider who would be brought in, and other times he might be even an insider. But the key is he has to be loyal to the king. He has to be loyal to the empire that he serves. So Cyrus the Great, he essentially liberated all those southern Israelites that were brought from Jerusalem and Judea, and he also liberated the northern Israelites that were previously conquered by the Assyrians. And that's how people came back to Jerusalem, back to Judea, and started to repopulate their land. This was actually done with the royal blessing and the royal decree. And even some funds were set aside to help them reestablish. It was within his interest that that land would not be empty, that the land would be prosperous, and they just keep paying taxes, basically. So that was the Persian idea. Now, in the act of his benevolence, Cyrus actually returned some of the items which were taken from Jerusalem temple. And he aided the rebuilding of a holy place and the walls of the city. That was really big of him. He actually says, I want you to succeed. Your success means my success, more taxes from me if you have a nice, stable society. So he says, I'll help you out. I'll give you back some of the stuff we stole. Well, not we, Nebuchadnezzar stole, but I have no use for it. I have plenty of gold, so you go. So he gave them some of the stuff back and sent them back. And so when Judeans began to return to Jerusalem, this is 6th century BCE, they started to rebuild their temple, to rebuild the city. The people of Samaria, remember Samaria was repopulated, they decided to offer them their aid. However, the leaders of the returned exiles rejected their offer. We wonder why. Well, I think the biblical record actually tells us why. This is straight out of the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 4 begins this way. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. Sounds harsh, right? But there's a reason why. You have to understand the reason why. Remember who these people are. They resettled northern Israel. They have created their own system of worship, but they say, let us build with you. Let us have a nice big society. Remember at that point, Samaria, they are a depressed country. They're a small conquered country with a handful of people trying to survive in a land, and it's harsh, and they're looking for alliances. They're looking for support. So they said, let us build with you. We already worship your God, so we can all be friends. This is no different than what we read in Torah, where, you remember, the inhabitants of Shechem tells to Jacob's family, let's just all intermarry. We'll give you our daughters, and you give us your daughters, and we'll just all become relatives. But then there's a little problem. This is our land, and if we are your relatives, we're not going to be able to get you out of our land, ever. So there's a problem of making alliances with foreigners, and especially spiritual alliances like what they are proposing here. So they say, let us worship. We worship your God. We've been sacrificing to him for a long time. Why can't we just get along and be friends? And he says, you have nothing to do with building this temple. You see, people in Samaria, they also wanted a temple too. That actually we know from the pages of history. Some of the Samaritan-owned documents tell us that even before, as they were in Babylon, they were already thinking about building a temple in Samaria to rival the one in Jerusalem at some point. So those who made the offer were clearly foreign transplants who opted to worship Israel's God. Why? Out of necessity. They moved to the land, and that land belonged to that deity. These were not other Israelites who thought that Judeans should have their own temple. please understand. Remember, the disagreement between the north and the south is that they said, no, the temple needs to be in the north. This is the center. Samaria is supposed to be the center. And there was a final disagreement between the southern Israelites and northern Israelites on the location of the holy place and things like that. So these particular Samaritans were clearly the outsiders that we're talking about. And this is the reason why the leaders of Israel rejected their help and even called them adversaries. It's very clear. So Ezra does not really mince words. I mean, he tells us right away, these are the adversaries who came and made a proposal to us. But in the end, they were really not our friends. Just like the inhabitants of Shechem who made an offer to Jacob's family to intermarry, were not really their friends. They were going to absorb that small group of Israelites, and that's it. So the book of Kings basically explains that some people in Samaria worshipped Israel's God. And they also worshiped the gods of other nations. We know that. So we have a little bit of biblical record to help us piece these things together. But besides the biblical record, there are some other sources, although we have to really wonder how accurate they are. So here's another biblical source right here. It says in 2 Kings 17, they feared the Lord and served their own gods according to the custom of the nations from among whom they have been carried away into exile. To this day, they do according to the earlier customs. They do not fear the Lord, nor do they follow their statutes, their ordinances, or the law, or the commandments which the Lord commanded the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Notice the terminology that the book of Kings uses all the time. It's going to keep using the word Jacob and Israel, and this is clearly a community of outsiders who are living in that land, and they're not really honoring the God of Israel, but they're not even honoring their own God because they're kind of intermixed all these things, and they're trying to do everything and all things because in the end, they're practical people. They just want to survive. They're stuck in that way of thinking that that land belongs to the God of Israel, and they have to deal with him essentially in some way, shape, or form. So far entrenched that belief was. I don't know if you realize how much that affects things. Do you remember the story of Naaman, the Aramean? When Naaman the Aramean decided to go back to Aram, he made a request of bringing the dirt with him. You know why he did that? Because the land of Israel is where Israel's God dwells. In his thinking, the land and God is connected. So if he's going to take some of the sacks of dirt of Israel with him back to Aram, he can actually worship the God of Israel by standing on the soil of Israel. And that in that way, that blessing that he received will continue to flow. Because he realized, this is real. I want the real with me. Can I at least have it to go? So he packaged it up and said, can we load up some donkeys and take some of that dirt with me? The holy dirt from the Holy Land, where I have encountered this amazing God. So deeply, basically, built in this belief in Near Easterners that the land and the deities are connected to that land. And so we see that all over in different places. So according to Ezra, chapter 4, that we've been looking at a little bit, after Israel's leaders rejected the offer to help them rebuild the Jerusalem temple and the city walls, the same inhabitants of Samaria actually started a campaign against them with the Persian government. They went to the Persians and said, these people are rebuilding the city, they're going to rebuild the walls, they're going to rebuild the temple, and they're going to rebel against you. Because we heard them say so. They started spreading rumors among the Persian government that these people are just rebels, they're never going to stay loyal to you, you just let them rebuild those walls. The next thing you know, they're going to rebel. Well, they were not entirely wrong maybe, but actually Israel stayed quite loyal to the Persians for a long time throughout history. But what happened is they started this campaign against Ezra and Nehemiah and those early Israelites who were trying to resettle the land. And so they were successful in obstructing the progress. The land, basically they stopped the restoration. They were forbidden to rebuild the city. They were forbidden to rebuild the temple. They just said, fine, you live there, you live, but you cannot rebuild. And that did not change until basically King Darius, a new king, took over the Persian throne. And we can read about that in Ezra chapter 4, verse 24. And so a new king came and new rules came in. And we know that eventually Israelites were allowed to rebuild their city. But it took a new king.
There's an interesting passage in the Elephantine Papyri that includes letters addressed to Jerusalem leaders and to Samaritans asking for assistance in building a temple in Egypt. Do you remember when I talked about the Elephantine, this interesting colony of Jews way, in Africa, in the middle of the Nile River, set this island of Elephantine. And a colony of Jews settled there. They built their own society, had their own little city-state, and they wanted to build a temple. So at that point, this is the same point in history where Samaritans want to build their temple, Jews want to build their temple, and Elephantine Jews want to build their own temple. Everyone's going to want to build their own temple, and they actually start asking each other for donations. Hey, we want to build a temple. Will you guys help us out? So we have historical evidence that Elephantine papyri that have copies of these letters asking for help. So clearly, the Jews in Elephantine who were building a temple knew about people in Samaria who also had the same aspirations as people in Jerusalem. And this is all the same time frame in history. So as these people live and exist without temples, yearning and hoping to have one. So Jews in Elephantine did build a temple, by the way, which Jerusalemites were not happy about. Because that was a little bit of a competition, a little bit of a problem. You cannot worship one God of Israel in multiple places. That was a little bit of a problem. They needed to have one central location. And so that created quite a bit of a contention. But the Elephantine Jews were Jews. They were Israelites. They were quite religious and very Torah observant and seemed to really, really care about these things, which is why they wanted to build a temple in the first place. Anyway, it's an interesting piece of history to kind of connect some of the dots for you. Now, the chief enemy of the returned exiles was a ruler called Sanballat. I don't know if you've heard this name before or not.
Yes.
But his name comes from a Babylonian word, Sinubalit, which means the begotten of Sin. Sin is the name of a Sumerian moon god. I don't know if you know this or not, but people in that part of the world has been worshiping moon god from the ancient of times. People in North Babylon, Haran, basically that area, they've been worshiping moon gods for a long time. And you could still see that in the Middle Eastern culture today. Some Islamic flags feature a moon. That's a remnant of the moon god worship, at least in my opinion, I would say so. The begotten of Sin, okay, the deity, a Sumerian god of the moon. Nehemiah called Sanballat the governor of Samaria, and he also called him a Haroni, a Haronite, which could mean that he was from Haran, which is the city in northern Mesopotamia, which would make sense. And we don't know much about Sanballat, but we know that he had sons who also had the same name, so kind of like the Herod. You know, you have Herod. Would you like to meet my son Herod? And would you like to meet my grandson Herod? So like they all had that name, and they kept passing it around. And so sometimes the history, because we have little bits and pieces, is not exactly certain 100% which Sanballat we're talking about, because there are records that talk about Sanballat ruling from the time of Cyrus and Darius and all the way into Alexander. Well, guess what? That's a lot of time. Usually rulers do not stay alive that long and prosper and rule a land that long. So we assume that it has to be one of his sons or maybe even a grandson. So Sanballat is kind of like a family name, basically, that they carry on. But these people are probably from Haran, the ancestral home of Abraham, right? So from that same area. Northern Babylon, basically. And he was the enemy. He was the enemy of Ezra and Nehemiah. Why? Because he particularly opposed them. He's the one who would go and petition the Persian government saying these people are rebels. Don't give them money. Don't help them to rebuild their city, because all they're going to do is rebel against you. So Sanballat wanted to have a temple in Samaria as well. And after the Israelites returned to their homeland, Manasseh, the high priest's grandson, who served in the temple, also married Sanballat's daughter. And then he refused to put her away after Nehemiah confronted him. Do you remember the whole story in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah about the foreign wives? And that was an issue.
Well, that's when this was going on. So when now you have a person who is a priest, essentially, marrying Sanballat's daughter, this is creating a problem. And so he had to put her away. He had to divorce her. And Manasseh was eventually expelled from Judah. And that is probably how the Samaritan priesthood was started. And an independent Samaritan temple was established, most likely out of this union of Manasseh, who was a legitimate Levitical priest, essentially, who married Sanballat's daughter. The story and the history just gets messier and messier. Again, you have to understand why the adversary relationship. Why? Because in a sense, we're talking about the same family, but we're talking about different ideology, different values, different things that are important to you, and people are now working against each other, competing, trying to build competing temples. In this case, the Samaritan priesthood was most likely established by Manasseh. I will tell you a little bit about how this happened. And I don't know if I can trust everything here, but Josephus does not like Samaritans very much. So I'll be honest with you. He does talk about this history now. This is straight out of Antiquities from section 11. It says, Jaddua succeeded the high priesthood. He had a brother whose name was Manasseh. Now there was one, Sanballat, who was sent by Darius, the last king of Persia, into Samaria. He was a Kuthian by birth, of which stock were Samaritans also. So if you haven't figured this out, Josephus does not like Samaritans. He thinks they're Kuthians. He thinks they're outsiders, they're foreigners. As far as he's concerned, there's nothing good that he can say about Samaritans, actually. So it's going to come out, it's going to come out in his own words that you're going to see a little bit of a bias there. He says, this man knew that the city of Jerusalem was a famous city. And I'm abbreviating here a little bit. So that he willingly gave his daughter, whose name was Nicaso, in marriage to Manasseh, as thinking this alliance by marriage would be a pledge and security that the nation of the Jews should continue their goodwill to him. So, he's making a political alliance because he does not want to get conquered at some point. And so if we're intermarried, again, same old story, then you can't conquer me. Solomon tried that, right? Solomon had how many wives? And why in the world would he need that many wives? No, probably not a practical reason, but political alliances. Because if we're related, I'm not going to attack you, you're not going to attack me.
You know, it's kind of funny when it comes to like historical enmities, you know, wars between houses and feuds and whatnot. It seems like the deepest and most bitter ones are the ones where the two parties are the most similar. Mm-hmm. It's not, you know, a foreign adversary who's completely different to you in every single way. It's one thing. But when they're almost 98% like you in every single way, it's almost like they're a doppelganger, they're a counterfeit, they're running off with my face and my name, I hate them, you know, it runs deeper.
And that's why Jews and Samaritans have a problem with each other, because they actually have a claim to the same exact things. This same descent, same ideas, same God, same revelation, same Torah, same Moses. So yeah, you have a lot of overlap, and that's why you're going to have a lot of animosity, because you're competing for the same turf, essentially, of being the Israelite community.
Yeah.
So one will call the other ones fakes, and the other one calls the other ones fakes, and that's what happens. So you're absolutely right, Drake. You know, that's how it goes. So you can see a little bit of animosity here, even in Josephus. He's going to say things about Samaritans that are not nice. He calls them Kuthians, basically, of which stock Samaritans are also. That's what he says. So yeah, that's right. That's where they're from. Let's read a little bit more. It says, but the elders of Jerusalem quarreled with him. So they're talking about Manasseh. About the marriage of foreign wives. And that this should be the beginning of a mutual society with foreigners. Remember, that isn't that the issue in Ezra and Nehemiah? We cannot have this society that is multicultural, that's foreigners. We're trying to build our national homeland. We're trying to restore Israel, not to recreate what we had in Babylon. So they commanded Manasseh to divorce his wife, or not to approach the altar. And the high priest himself joining with the people of their indignation against his brother and driving him away from the altar. So they basically said, divorce this woman or you're not the priest anymore. That's it. Whereupon Manasseh came to his father-in-law, Sanballat. And I'm abbreviating the story again. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but what's missing over there in the ellipsis is they had a nice conversation back and forth. Basically, he's complaining to Sanballat, and Sanballat's going to solve his problems. Sanballat promised him not only to preserve him the honor of his priesthood. He actually did come to Sanballat and said, guess what? I'm going to divorce your daughter. And Sanballat says, no, don't do it. Don't do it. I have a solution. Sanballat promised him not only to preserve his honor of his priesthood, but to procure for him the power and the dignity of a high priest. And he would make him governor of all the places he himself ruled, and if he would keep his daughter for his wife. He also told him further that he would build him a temple like that at Jerusalem upon Mount Gerizim, which is the highest of all the mountains that are in Samaria. So remember, Samaritans had a temple on top of Mount Gerizim. And that's, according to Josephus, is how this came to be. Sanballat says, don't worry, Manasseh, I got you covered. You will be a priest. You will have your power. You will have your dignity. In fact, I'm going to make sure that you're going to have a temple in which to be as a priest. And I'm going to put it on this tallest mountain that we have right here, which happens to be Gerizim. So that's kind of how Josephus tells the story. Did it happen that way? I don't know. I don't know for sure. But at least that's the little tiny bits and pieces of information that we can glean from the history. And Josephus, he's writing in the end of the 1st century. Maybe that's how it happened. So let me give you just a little bit more here. This is probably how, I would say, the Samaritans temple came to be. It's a guess, but that's a good guess. The book of Maccabees, however, suggests that under pressure from the Seleucid king, the Samaritans later dedicated their temple to Zeus.
Yes.
Now, which Seleucid king would you think we're talking about?
Antiochus?
Antiochus IV, right? Seleucid kings were not always adversarial with Israel, but the fourth, Antiochus I, was great to Israel, but Antiochus IV was terrible. So, as they come to the whole area, now we're talking about the Maccabees, right? Now we're into 2nd century BCE, right? The middle of the 2nd century. As Antiochus tries to enforce his culture, his own Greek ways, up onto the whole entire territory he rules, guess what? Samaritans fall under that jurisdiction too, and Jews as well. They're neighbors. So the book of Maccabees writes this. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, which in Greek is Zeus Zenios, as did the people who lived in that place. So the book of Maccabees actually tells us that there was this pressure and that Samaritans actually succumbed to the pressure. They actually, this is Jason of Alexandria, he says they did rename their temple. Now, they wanted Jews in Jerusalem to rename their temple after Zeus. They didn't go for it, hence the Maccabean revolt, right? But the Samaritans, they said, okay, sure, we'll rename the temple into whatever you want us to rename it, just don't touch us, don't mess with us, leave us alone, let us be in peace. So the Samaritans kind of went a different way. Again, this is the book of Maccabees. This is another piece of information. And now we're talking about a different power. This is after Alexander the Great. And what's important is that for us to know that at this point, the temple on Mount Gerizim already exists. So by the year 150, the temple is already there because you can't rename something that doesn't exist. So when did the temple come to be? We're not exactly sure. But we know that maybe Manasseh had something to do with it and Sanballat, and they kind of laid the plans, and it later happened. And so during the Maccabean era, there is such thing as a Samaritan temple in Samaria on top of Mount Gerizim, because they are the ones who are being pressured to rename it after Zeus, the friend of strangers, Zeus Zenius. So we are trying to rebuild all these little bits and pieces together just from what we have.
And hopefully these little trails of history are interesting to you. If I read too much from Josephus, I'm sorry. He's just one of a few sources that we have on antiquity. So this is Antiquities 12. Josephus explains to us what Samaritans did during the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes. He says many Jews, and this is going to be talking about that time now, many Jews there were who complied with the king's commands, either voluntarily or out of fear of the penalty that was denounced. But the best men and those of the noblest souls did not regard him, on which account they every day underwent great miseries and bitter torments, for they were whipped with rods, and their bodies were torn to pieces, and they were crucified, and while they were still alive and breathed, they also strangled those women and their sons whom they had circumcised. So, this is the persecution of Antiochus. We know about this from the book of Maccabees. It was brutal. Jews were being forced into Hellenistic culture. That's why the revolt happened. So it describes a little bit of what was happening with the Jewish community. Then Josephus turns to Samaritans, and he says, when the Samaritans saw the Jews under these sufferings, they no longer confessed that they were their kindred, nor that the temple on Mount Gerizim belonged to Almighty God. This was according to their nature, as we have already shown. See, he doesn't like them. He says, I told you they were no good. So this is what he's saying. This is just the kind of thing these people would do. They turned on us. They said that they worship the same God we do, but then the moment that's not convenient, no, they don't. They said that they're our relatives, that they're also Israelites, but the moment that's not convenient and we get persecuted, oh no, we're not related to them. And so Josephus says, and they now said that they were a colony of Medes and Persians. And indeed, they were a colony of theirs. So again, Josephus is saying they're foreigners, they're outsiders, I told you so. They said otherwise, and I still am telling you so, because under pressure, when it all comes to this, and they're persecuted, they're going to say, oh, no, we're not Israelites, we're not Jews, we have nothing to do with this. We're just Medes and Persians. We're foreigners living in this land of northern Israel. So there's this, you can hopefully start to understand why there was such a contention between these two communities, why the conflict was so harsh, why one denounced the other, and vice versa. There was a lot of animosity and disagreement. And a lot of it is built on history of other people coming and putting pressure and manipulating people into these kinds of actions. There were a lot of Jews who succumbed to the same pressure. They became Hellenists. Well, why wouldn't Samaritans succumb to the same pressure and do the same? Why? Because they want to survive. And so they will do anything, according to Josephus, they'll do anything and they will say anything. They will get them out of this pickle. So he paints them in a very disreputable way, saying this is the kind of people they are, that's what they do. But they say they're one of us, they're kindred, but then they're not. So very critical statements, if you want to say that. So let me stop right here. I think this is probably a good stopping point before I get into further, because I have more and more pages of history for you. Hopefully you find this fascinating. This is the history of Northern Israelites. This is the history of Samaritan people. Hopefully it's becoming real to you why the relationship was so tense. All right, so I'll pause here and we'll pick up next week.